We've entered the month of October, and I think it's safe to say that we are officially in autumn. Ooh, Nutella, you are so close to the candle flames. There you go, that's better. We are halfway done with the capsule wardrobe, which means that today we are working on the third piece in our installation, and this piece kind of pairs well with what we did last time, which is a skirt, and we're going to do the matching vest. If you watched my skirt video, then you'll know that I wasn't super happy with the striping effect that was happening with my yarn, but I didn't want my skirt and vest to be mismatched, so I used the same yarn setup for my vest. And all of your lovely comments really helped me appreciate the skirt that I made a little bit more, and it made me really happy. If you remember from when we went over the patterns, this is the vest pattern that I'm going to be knitting up on my knitting machine. I did have a few comments asking me if I'll ever go back to hand knitting, and yes, the next video will actually be hand knitting. I hope you enjoy this one, and stay tuned for the next one, which will be a hand knit piece for this capsule wardrobe. But I'm also not going to be doing any kind of zigzag pattern for the vest because that's not what the skirt is, and I again want the skirt and vest to be a little bit cohesive. Knowing that none of the zigzag patterns that I tested or potentially could do on the machine were something that I wanted for my piece, I decided to go through some vintage vest patterns from the 1940s, and what stuck out to me was kind of a cabled vest, but one that isn't cabled all over, but has like a center accent cabled strip. I wanted to redesign my knitting pattern to not only go from a hand knit pattern to a machine knit pattern, but to have 3 centered columns of cables. I personally do that by using spreadsheets and calculations to reconfigure a pattern from hand knit to machine knit. I will say vintage patterns are easier because they are meant to be knit flat in pieces from the bottom up, which is exactly how I use my knitting machine, so that does make it easier. But if you're interested in knowing like a step-by-step detail how-to, let me know, and that's something that I can consider creating sometime in the future. I've also had quite a few questions on how easy or difficult it would be to use a knitting machine versus hand knitting. I will say it has saved my wrists, fingers, and forearms, but it is a bit of a core workout when you're moving the carriage left and right. It helps to know what a knitting stitch is, but even if I didn't know how to knit, I would have been able to learn how to use a knitting machine. The skills are vastly different. There is a steep learning curve, but there are some wonderful channels on YouTube that will help you learn how to use your particular machines, how to service them. So if you buy a vintage one, you can figure out how to service them. Roberta Rose Meads, The Answer Lady Knits, and Knitology 1 by 1 are 3 channels that I reference the most when I use my knitting machine and when I think of projects to do on my knitting machines. If you can get your hands on one that is reasonably priced, or maybe there's a knitting machine guild near you where you can try out a knitting machine before you invest in buying one and see if it's something that you might like, I do find that it gives me a lot more versatility in what I'm able to create, and while it's a bit of a core workout, it does save my hands for hand knitting on those pieces that I really want to hand knit myself versus something that I can create on my machine. All the rambling on about the details aside, I think it's time for us to sit down at my knitting machine to get started on making this vest. Let's start with the front piece, which is I think the most complicated because it has those cabling designs in it. In my past few videos where I'm working at my knitting machine, I have mentioned that I cast on, but I've never really shown it in detail, and I think it's an interesting process, so I wanted to show you how I do that. You just watched me push all of the working needles into the working position, which means every other needle on my main bed and my ribber. I then move the carriage back and forth across the machine, and that puts the needles from the hold position into the working position. I then loop the yarn into my carriage, and I move that across, and that puts the initial bit of yarn on each and every single needle. What I'm pulling out now is kind of like my cast on comb. It's these little teeth that stick up between all of the stitches, and it has a wire that sits through it so that it can hang on to the yarn that you've already looped through all of the needles that you have in their working position. So here the teeth are coming up between the yarn, and then the wire goes back through the teeth, and then I can let go of that cast on comb and I hang some weights from it, and that kind of holds down your in work piece as you knit. You need some of that downwards tension for the knitting stitches to catch. So now I'm knitting back from right to left, and this part is interesting in my opinion because you're only working either the main bed or the ribber. It's kind of like tubular knitting. You can actually knit circular socks when you have a ribber and a main bed on a flatbed knitting machine if you use this technique, but it's only done for the first 2 rows to kind of create a really nice, neat cast on edge. The tension's also really high in the beginning to help not get like a wobbly edge at the bottom, and then you slowly decrease the tension, so you're working with looser and looser tension as you go up. And now I have cast on in knit 1 purl 1 ribbing on my knitting machine and my ribber bed, and I'll just keep working in this knit 1 purl 1 rib until I have the 2.5 to 3 inches of ribbing at the bottom done. Can you tell that I had some fun using the ultra slow mode on my camera? But anyway, now the ribbing is done and it's time to move all the stitches that I don't need on the ribber anymore from the ribber to the main bed. This I do with manual manipulation, and I'm going to do it to all the stitches except for these sets of 4 in the middle, because I want the 3 cable columns to be surrounded by purl stitches to really bring out the cables in more detail. This is also the case when you do hand knitted cables. A lot of times they're surrounded by at least 2 purl stitches on either side, because that makes the cable stand out a lot more against the rest of your stockinette knitting. I decided to do 6 wide cables, so 3 and 3 that are then crossed over each other. They are also worked with manual manipulation, and I watched Knitology's 1x1s videos to kind of learn how to do the cables, although she looks so elegant and it looks so easy when she does it, versus I edited out a lot of fumbling here when I was working on the cables. I ended up getting better by the end, but I was still struggling here at the beginning to cross the stitches over each other and make the cables work on my machine. I needed to do 90 rows from the bottom of the, or top of the ribbing to the underarm shaping, like the armhole shaping. And I have been stuck on row 60 since last night. So I've redone rows like 58 to 60. I think this is going to be my 4th redo. And rather than losing my mind about it yesterday, I decided to stop and revisit it today, which is what we're looking at. And why did I have to redo it? Well, you might see right here, we have a broken thread. Actually, we broke 2 threads. So we broke the entire yarn that we were working with because I think we were putting too much tension on the crossover at the cabling. Why hasn't this happened until row 60, where I have already done like 9 cables? I'm just reading my knitting with my fingers from what I can feel. And I realized last night I increased the weight because at the edges Nutella was really cute. I was having some issues with the end stitches skipping a little bit, so I added more weight to the bottom of my knitting. I created, I think, this is my theory, I haven't tested it yet, but I think it created too much tension on the stitches that are being stretched for the cabling. So I think what I need to do is probably loosen up, like lighten up on the amount of weight that I have on my yarn, like knitting overall. I think I just need to pull it by hand on the ends right there. I've done that in the past and that's allowed me to get a lot more feel for what's happening. I've been going up on the tension dial, so I've been loosening my tension on the row before I do the cabling, so I'll continue to do that. First, I'm going to have to unknit this. So I'm going to take the yarn out of the carriage, and then there's like a special technique that you can do. It's not super fast, but it's also faster than I thought it would be. I'll retie the yarn on in a way such that hopefully it won't cause tangles. I'm ready to get knitting again, so let's do that. I just undid it. I don't know if you can see it. Hold on. I thought it had ripped. It didn't actually rip. It's where the yarn did actually rip. my previous at least 3 attempts to knit these rows. And each time I would tie the yarn back together in a different way. And so what I thought was a split yarn end, because it looked exactly the same to the previous times that it had ripped, was actually the tie ends of one of the knots. So I didn't need to do this. Oh, okay. Well, you can't just stop unraveling a row in the middle of it. I have to unravel the entire rest of it and then redo this. Oh, we lost one. We lost one. It's fixed. It's fixed. Ah! Ow. Ooh. Ow. We are now at the point where we're done with the cabling because we are working up to the neckline now. You can see how it looks different on the machine where it's really tensioned versus the bottom where there isn't as much tension on it. The cables are looking fantastic, but we also need to work on the U neckline by doing the shaping there. So we're only going to be working on about 1/3 of the stitches on one side at a time. You can do this by putting the needles into the non-working position, and then you have to make sure some latches are flipped on your carriage so that it won't work when they're on the non-knitting position, so you don't accidentally drop all your stitches off your machine. I have done that before and it's been really sad. If you look at some of my early machine knitting stocking videos, that happens to me more than once. But here you can see I'm knitting 2 rows and then I am decreasing on the machine. This movement right here is how you decrease stitches, so you're basically putting needles out of work and you're moving stitches off of them back and forth until you reduce down to what you need for the side of your neckline. And once you're done with your shaping on one side, this is what it looks like, and you're basically going to do the exact same thing over again on the other side. We are leaving the stitches with the cables on them live, but yeah, so this is kind of what it looks like on the other side. But like I was saying, we want to leave those stitches live because we're going to be adding the ribbing at the neckline to that. So we're going to be adding some waste yarn to this and knitting that off. A lot of people have asked me, why do I use so much waste yarn? Because I have had experiences in the past where I didn't do enough and then my piece unraveled. So I'd rather use way too much waste yarn than not enough. And our front piece is off the machine. Now it's off of our cast on comb, and this is what our front section of our vest looks like. You can see that the cables kind of become a lot more cohesive when it's not under so much tension. The striping of the yarn is coming through, but again, because it's so irregular, I'm hoping it isn't too noticeable as quote-unquote a mistake and more like a feature. Like a lot of you were telling me that it looked like a feature, and I am really enjoying how the cables look. And now we get to do the same thing all over again for the back panel, but no cabling required. Ah, man, look at that beautiful time lapse of me knitting on my knitting machine. I wanted to take a moment to just let you know that if you wanted to support me in different ways, then feel free to check out my patterns. I do sell vintage and antique knitting patterns on my Etsy and my Ravelry. I also have an Etsy shop where I sell some stickers and mugs if you're interested. If you don't want any of those, I also have a Patreon that has some exclusive content and you get videos early. And if none of that is your thing, but you still want to support me in some way, subscribing, liking, commenting are always really welcome, and I appreciate it so, so much. Okay, back to the knitting of this beautiful vintage vest. The front is off the machine, I love how it looks, and the back is off the machine. I knew it was simpler than the front, but it was like significantly more easy to do. We have the main pieces done. What needs to be added now is the neckline ribbing and the armhole ribbing. The instructions say to first join together just the left shoulder and then to knit the neck ribbing back and forth. And that reminded me of this book from my knitting machine. They have you join just the right shoulder, and then you knit the neckband, so the ribbing on the machine, and then you join the neckband to the rest of your sweater on the machine. This is very similar to what I did with my red sweater, and so I think I'm going to be doing that exact same thing. What I think I'll do is I will knit the armhole ribbing before I sew the side seam of the vest. Maybe you'll understand what I'm talking about when you see it here in progress. So I've sewn together the right shoulder seam on my knitting machine, and then I have knit the ribbing separately and then sewn it onto that open neckline using my knitting machine once again. I then sew up the other shoulder seam. So now I have these two big U shapes where the armholes are. Typically, patterns when you knit by hand would have you sew up the side seams and then pick up stitches and knit the ribbing on this, versus here I'm going to knit the ribbing flat on my knitting machine and then pick up the stitches and knit it together on my knitting machine. So that's what I'm doing here, and I wanted to show a little bit more detail on how I knit pieces together on my knitting machine, because previously it was all done very late at night and in the dark, and for the first time I'm doing it in the daytime. So the ribbing is currently live on the stitches on my machine. The armhole stitches I picked up on either end and then in the middle because I want to distribute the stitches nice and evenly, and I put them onto the needles as well. And then with a very loose tension, I knit just one row. Even with a loose tension, you can see it's a bit of a struggle. And then I work again from left to right to cast off the stitches. And what you get after doing all of that is this. You have ribbing attached to where the armhole is, and that was all done flat on my knitting machine, which is a lot easier. I find sewing pieces together on the knitting machine to be much easier than doing it by hand. Here the ribbing is done on the other armhole. Honestly, in the future, I think I'm not going to do sewing things together. I'm going to do picking up stitches and doing the ribbing, but that's a discussion for another time, and you learn while doing all of this. Now, the last step is to sew up the side seams, and once again, what am I going to do? I'm going to do that on the knitting machine. So I'm showing you the two side seams that I'm going to sew together on my knitting machine. My vest is off the machine. Everything is sewn together. All the borders are on. All that needs to happen is all of these ends need to be woven in. So the last step of finishing needs to happen. But before I do that and I show you the final reveal, I did want to tell you I had worries when I was doing this skirt and sweater set that I would not have enough yarn to finish it. And this is one of the two yarns. It has a pretty good amount left. I mean, not a ton, but like I couldn't make a pair of socks with this even. It's not enough for that, but I had wiggle room. This is the other one. This bit is all I had left. I just made it. That was a pretty close game of yarn chicken. I've played closer when I hand knit with yarns that I know, but this is a little nerve-wracking because it's machine knitting with yarn that I don't truly really know the yardage of. But we got it all off. We got it all nearly finished. Let me go weave in the ends and then I will meet you at the final reveal. Knit vest is complete and I'm overall really happy with it. I like the redesign with the 3 columns of cables in the middle. I think it's so cute. The striping bothers me still, I have to admit it. On the skirt, I feel like I've accepted it, but the vest is so much smaller, so I think the striping is much more noticeable on it. But overall, I'm really, really happy with this piece. I highly recommend a vest as a first wearable to make on a knitting machine because you don't have to make sleeves, so it's a lot less pieces to get your hands around and to get a handle on. Overall, I'm really happy with it. Thank you so much for watching. Next week, I'll be making my last piece of the capsule wardrobe, which will be a fully hand knit item. So feel free to subscribe if you want to be kept in the loop about that. And I'll see you next time. Bye.